Hi, welcome back. This is our third part of our immigration story. Thanks for joining us all the way through. In our first part, we discussed the application process in very fine detail. If you're interested in moving to Canada, I suggest you look at this video. In part 2, we discussed actually moving to Canada during peak COVID and all the challenges that were associated with moving during this time. It was very difficult, but we made it all the way through. In this part of the series, our last part of our three-part series, we're going to discuss settling in Canada and all the challenges we faced. This is how we settled in Canada. This may not be your circumstance when you actually make the move because obviously COVID is over. You may not have a quarantine plan. In this episode, we're going to discuss setting up bank account, getting a place to live, getting new phones, getting your driver's license, purchasing a car. If you're interested, please stay tuned. And without further ado, so let's get started. We'll start where we left off in part 2, where we landed in Canada. Now, the only mode of transport available to us to actually leave the airport to be transported to our Airbnb in downtown Toronto was taxis. Family members weren't allowed to pick us up in the airport because of COVID protocols, but it was fine. We arrived at our Airbnb in downtown Toronto. It was a bit sunny. But by the time we actually moved our luggage up to the Airbnb, it was a condo in downtown Toronto. It got dark really fast. It was about, let's say, 6:30 when we got to the Airbnb. We were a bit tired from our journey. We were very exhausted. We were hungry at the same time. But again, we made it and we were very happy to be in Canada. We were very happy to be confirmed as permanent residents. We chose this Airbnb because we wanted fresh air, because in the quarantine plan that at the time the COVID protocols regulated is that we actually had to specify where we were going to stay for 14 days in our quarantine, and we were not allowed to leave our place of quarantine. We actually had to give in very fine detail how we were going to get food items, how we were going to there's actually a part of the quarantine plan where they specify how you're going to get fresh air. So we actually chose this Airbnb because there was a balcony. Well, obviously, we're going to look outside. We just arrived in Canada. We want to see the sights. And we chose downtown Toronto because we had family nearby. Our family actually dropped food items for us. The Airbnb had a small kitchenette that allowed us to prepare small meals for ourselves. We had to specify how we were going to get meals for this 14-day quarantine. So we use Uber Eats and DoorDash. Now, this option is very simple for us. We just download the app, sign in with our information. We can actually use our Trinidadian credit cards. Actually, on the third day, the government of Canada actually called us individually to check up on us because at that point in time, the COVID protocols regulated that we actually remain in our quarantine stay. They called us to ask us a couple of routine questions, how we were feeling, if we had any COVID symptoms. Now, the first order of business, the most important thing that you need to do right when you land in Canada as soon as possible is open bank accounts. Now for us, we did not know what banks were available in Canada, so we had to do our research. And we found that the top 5 banks in our area and what were available to us were RBC, otherwise known as Royal Bank of Canada, TD, Toronto Dominion, the Bank of Nova Scotia, which is commonly known as Scotiabank, BMO, which is known as Bank of Montreal, and CIBC, Canada Imperial Bank of Commerce. We looked at their Newcomer Programs. All of them offer Newcomer Programs. They know that you're a new resident, a new permanent resident, a new immigrant to Canada, and they actually want to get you started immediately. So they offer the Newcomer packages. If I actually go onto the website right now and I look up what the Newcomer packages are for these banks, it changes all the time. Every couple of months they actually update them. They offer new packages, they offer new deals. Now, on reviewing the Newcomer packages for these top 5 banks, I came up with a list. These are the tips that I recommend that you look for when looking at the Newcomer packages and comparing Newcomer packages among the top 5 banks. These annual fees are associated to your credit cards. Now, just like any other bank, if you had credit cards before, you will know that annual fees are associated to your credit cards and you pay a certain amount every year. Now, these banks actually waiver that annual fee. Some banks actually waiver this annual fee for the first year, as opposed to other banks that waiver the annual fee for 6 months. So you really need to weigh your options and see what is best suited for your situation and your family. Another point to look at is maintaining a minimum balance. Now, the top 5 banks, all of them actually tell you that you need to maintain a minimum balance in your account. The minimum balance at the point in time when we started was 4,000 Canadian dollars. Now, as a new immigrant within the newcomer packages, this minimum balance fee is actually waived for the first year. Now, after this first year, you need to pay attention, because if you don't maintain this balance and it falls below this $4,000 for any day of the month, let's say for instance you maintain a balance over $4,000 for 30 days, and on the 31st day of the month it falls below $4,000, you're going to be charged $16.95. This is regardless of any other transactions you make throughout the whole month. So it's very important to keep this in mind and read your fine print for setting up the newcomer packages. Another aspect of the newcomer packages that I recommend that you look out for is that each bank gives different bonuses. So at the point in time when we were setting up our banks, they actually gave us $300 if we did 3 or 4 out of a list of 5 items. So for instance, if we set up our utility bills as an automatic payment at the end of the month, if we allowed our salaries to run through the bank account, also if we were able to do an online payment, these were some of the items that actually led to us getting a bonus of a couple $100 in our bank account for absolutely free. These newcomer packages offer you to open checking accounts, saving accounts, and they actually offer you credit cards. The credit card limit varies from bank to bank. Look around and see what is available to you and which one best suits you. These small limits were due to COVID, and when we actually made the appointments and went into the banks, having conversations, they told us that the limits were actually more, but due to COVID, they restricted them. Now, attending our bank appointment, we asked a lot of questions. We actually sit and we planned what kind of questions to ask our financial advisor. We asked questions surrounding our accounts, if it was savings, if it was checkings, the type of credit card that were offered to us in the newcomer packages. We actually discussed credit card limits, the credit card cycles, how do you pay your credit card, if you don't pay it on time, what happens, and the most important thing, our credit score. It's very important that you decide which credit card you choose, because places like Costco, which is the Canadian equivalent of PriceMart, which is a members only club that sells in wholesale, they only accept MasterCard. And as a member of Costco, you get free access to their gas station, which is a members only gas station. Weigh your options and see what plans is best suited for you. We left that bank appointment, we had debit cards in our hands, and we set up our credit cards. They were already approved and they were actually going to be mailed to us within a couple of days. You get everything approved immediately within that meeting. Now, what I want to mention right now is that as a new immigrant, you're going to start your credit history and you're going to have credit cards. Within your first year, our financial institutes recommended to us not to have more than 2 credit cards. As you start shopping around, you go to Walmart, you go to Canadian Tire, you go to Home Depot, you go to multiple financial institutions, you start weighing your options around, they're going to actually offer you credit cards. Trust me, it's a lot of credit card options that come to you, and fight the urge, do not accept them. Actually, if you actually try to accept them, you're going to be declined. And your credit score is going to be hit, because a hard inquiry is going to be made onto your credit score. But don't accept them and only stick to the big 5.
So while we were in quarantine and we were making our appointments, one of the other more critical appointments that we made was to apply for our SIN. So what is a SIN? SIN means Social Insurance Number. Basically, this is a number that only Canadian citizens, permanent residents, or temporary residents need in order to get a job and in order to access government programs and benefits. So basically, we went online to do our research. So Service Canada is the name of the organization that's responsible for issuing the SIN numbers. We made an appointment online and we ended up going in person for our appointment on our second day out of quarantine. So when we entered the Service Canada office, we were asked to present certain documents for verification. So we had to submit our COPR document, and as well we had to submit another form of ID, which was our passports. During that time, it took probably what seemed like half an hour at most, It wasn't crowded at all because, again, you could only go into the office based on appointment. We were able to get our SIN card the same day. You were actually given a paper copy with the SIN number on it. Now, it is very, very important that this SIN number not be disclosed to anyone. It is something you need to keep confidential. It is only intended to be used for job purposes. So when you are hired for a job, your employer will ask you for your SIN number, as well as your banking institutions will ask you for your SIN number. Outside of these two bodies, do not ever disclose this number to anyone. So the third major appointment that we were also planning while during quarantine was applying for our health insurance card. So in Canada, you do have access to universal healthcare once you are a permanent resident. Each province has their own health program. In Ontario, the name of the healthcare is known as OHIP, which is Ontario Health Insurance Plan. This covers appointments to your family doctor. It covers visits to walk-in clinics. It also covers medical tests and other types of procedures. This is also a very important step that you need to do as soon as you land, is to set up an appointment. So we found out that in Ontario, the center that was responsible for issuing these cards was known as Service Ontario. So we went on the Service Ontario website and we basically filled out an online application where we had to make an appointment. So we actually were able to schedule our appointment in person on the third day out of quarantine. And I remember, unlike the other appointments that we had, which was very easy, we were able to go inside with no issues. Service Ontario had a very long line outside of the centers because, again, this was peak COVID and the office was limiting the number of persons that were allowed in the office. So even though we made an appointment for a particular time slot, we spent just about 2 hours outside in a line, socially distanced, waiting to enter this office. Finally, when we were able to make it inside of the office, they asked us to submit our documents for verification. So once again, we had to submit our COPR, and we also had to submit another proof of ID, which was our passport. Unlike the SIN card, which we were able to get within the same day, our OHIP card, we were advised it would actually take around 2 to 3 weeks, and it would actually be mailed to our address.
Well, the next order of business was to get Canadian phone numbers. So Square One was close by. We went into Square One. There are a lot of options in Square One. There's Chatter, there's Rogers, Bell, you name it. There's a lot of options in Square One and any major shopping centers, any major malls. So we went in. What I do recommend when you're actually going in to get your SIM card and your new Canadian numbers is that you go when they have deals. So back to school deals, Easter deals, summer deals. There are always deals available to you, and they vary all the time. They change them actually by every 2 to 3 weeks. We took out postpaid plans. There are actually prepaid plans that are available, but because you're a new immigrant, you want to be able to make phone calls. Most postpaid plans offer you to make Canadian phone calls unlimited, free text anywhere in the entire world unlimited. But international calls are not covered on most postpaid plans. They're on the pricey end if you want to make international calls. If you do want to make international calls, I suggest you go to any of the phone companies and you actually purchase a phone card. For us, we just got the SIM cards. We got a deal because it was both of us. I'm sure they offer families different deals and such, and choose what's best for you.
So while we were in quarantine, one of the other major things that we did was we applied for jobs. So because, again, we had to quarantine for 14 days, we were doing research to figure out the appointments we need to set up. This was the time that we maximized to ensure that we started applying for jobs. So we did our research and we found a couple of websites that advertise a lot of vacancies. We'll list them down below. The most popular website that we used to apply for jobs was Indeed.ca. And this was actually the website that led us to both getting our first jobs. So I remember being in quarantine literally for hours at a time. We would both sit down and we would both be applying for jobs religiously. The reason why we decided to wait until we arrived in Canada to start applying for jobs, well, the main reason was because of COVID. We didn't know for certain when we actually would have gotten a flight to come to Canada. But more so, the reason why we waited till we arrived in Canada to start applying for jobs, because you would realize when you actually start going on these websites and you start filling out the application form, one of the most significant questions that the form will have on it will ask you, are you a permanent resident? Are you currently living in Canada? So we could not have done this if we were still in Trinidad. We actually had to wait until we landed in Canada so that at least we had validation that yes, we were confirmed as permanent residents and we were actually living in Canada. We also used other websites to apply for jobs. So we also looked at LinkedIn, we looked at ZipRecruiter, but the one that we used heavily was Indeed because it had the most amount of vacancies. So during the 2-week period when we were applying for jobs, I ended up getting an interview by the time that we left our quarantine. So I ended up doing my first interview, which was a virtual interview while we were staying in a local hotel in Mississauga. And that interview ended up leading me to getting my first job in Canada. And it took about a week after that first interview when I was confirmed that I got the job. And I started that job 1 month after. Now, one thing to note, when you're applying for jobs online, it's very, very important that you look at the location of the job. If it's either a remote job or if it requires you to actually go in person, because at this point in time, we were in a lockdown in Canada. Luckily, the employer that I was able to get my first job was an essential business and it was not a work from home job. So I had to show up every day to work. And it was very important that when I was applying for jobs on Indeed, I looked at the location and more importantly, I had to examine the public transportation route. So those are my top 2 tips. When you're applying for jobs as a new immigrant, look at the location, assess the distance, the commute time, and assess the public transportation to determine if it is feasible for you to accept this job. Luckily for Surin and I, when we were able to finally settle into our home, I looked at the transportation routes and we were in close proximity to a bus station. It was actually located directly outside of our housing community, and the distance to my place of work was within a matter of minutes. And that's the reason for me to accept this first offer. Surin, on the other hand, took a little bit longer. It actually took him 2 months to get his job. Now, what type of jobs did we both get? There was a lot of vacancies that we saw on these websites. I think we were both somewhat shocked by how many vacancies we saw on these websites because, again, we were in a lockdown in Canada, and at this point in time, only essential businesses remained open and were hiring persons to actually come to work in person. And luckily for both Surin and I, both of our jobs were essential businesses, and I believe that's why we were able to get these jobs so quickly. Now, what I would advise to any new immigrants coming to Canada, again, you would find that you can get a job anywhere here. At least what I found in Ontario, and at least when I was doing research, it's very easy. But you have to know your worth at the end of the day. You need to know your value and your skill set that you bring to the job.
So after our 14-day quarantine in our Airbnb in downtown Toronto, we needed to get from point A, which is our Airbnb, to Mississauga, our hotel that we booked in Mississauga. Unfortunately enough, your Trinidadian license is actually valid in Canada. You are allowed to rent a car for a maximum of 90 days. You're allowed to drive in Canada. with your Trinidadian driver's license. So now we actually plan to get our driver's license and purchase a car within the first year. And we planned accordingly. We set aside funds just for this, and that was our plan. So during my quarantine, I started to do research, looking to purchase a car. I actually went on the car dealerships within our hotel's area, and I simply looked up what the cost of a car was and like the options that I was interested in, and I started making appointments to go in and speak with them. Now, when you actually go into these dealerships, there are different options. There are three options. There's one, you could get a car on finance. There's two, you could get a car on lease, which is like a long-term rent, and the third option is that you could purchase a car upfront. If you have all the funds necessary to make the purchase, you could actually purchase a car. Now, as a new immigrant, you don't have credit history, and you are not allowed, or you won't be allowed to finance any new vehicles, and you won't be allowed to lease any new vehicles. You could only finance or lease new vehicles. You are not allowed to finance or lease used vehicles. So the only option that is available for new immigrants landing in Canada with limited credit history is purchasing a car. We did set aside funds for this, and within the first month, we were able to purchase our car. It wasn't anything fancy. It wasn't a Ferrari. It wasn't a Lamborghini. But we looked around and we got a really good deal. But the mistake that we made is that we purchased the car before we had our Canadian driver's license. Now, this is a very big mistake, and I recommend that take my steps so you avoid making the mistakes that we did. So before you go to purchase a car and you go into dealerships, you actually need to go through the process of getting a Canadian driver's license. After I made the purchase, the dealership was very friendly. They signed all the documents. I did all the paperwork, and I actually went the next day to make call around asking for car insurance. Now, sourcing around my options, looking for car insurance, to get car insurance in Ontario, you actually need a Canadian driver's license, which I did not have. I only had my Trinidadian driver's license.
So after speaking with the Canadian car insurance companies, they advised us that the only way we were going to get car insurance is if we had either a G2 or a G license in Ontario. So we did our research and we found out that the body that governs licenses in Ontario is known as the Drive Test Center. So we went on the website for the Drive Test Center and we found out we could not just get a G2 or a G license immediately. There's actually a hierarchy of driving licenses in Ontario. So in order to actually be eligible to even get a G2 or a G license, you first need to apply for what is called a G1 license. Everyone who comes to Canada must start off by getting this G1 license. So basically, we did some more research on the website and we found out this was the equivalent of doing regulations, just as in Trinidad. So we had to do a test that tested our theory and knowledge of road laws, road signs in Ontario. We were able to book a date for this test. So this test at the time was being done in person at the Drive Test Center. So we were actually able to book our tests to be done within the middle of September. Now, what is involved in preparation for doing this test? So we, again, from doing further research on the Drive Test Center website, we found out that we actually had to study for this test. There was a drive test manual online that was available for persons who were looking to do this test. And in typical Trini fashion, what did we do? We crammed the night before this scheduled test, thinking, well, if it's anything like Trinidad regulations, this is gonna be easy. I remember in Trinidad, back when we did our regulations, I remember it was about a 4-page pamphlet. When we actually reviewed this manual the night before our actual test, it was not a 4-page pamphlet. It was actually well over 100 pages. And it just had a lot of information, a lot of technical information about the different road laws, about the different road signs, and we had to know it all because we did not know what kind of questions were going to come on this test. So literally, we spent hours staying up in the night in our hotel room studying and trying to cram everything into, hopefully being able to pass this test. There was a lot of pressure on both of us to pass this test because we had already paid for this car. So I remember the next day when we went into the actual drive test center. Now, again, this was during COVID protocols. It was a lockdown at that point in time. And the drive test center was limiting the number of persons who are allowed to enter the center. So we actually had to wait outside in a line for what seemed like 2 or 3 hours, socially distanced. I remember it was very cold. We did not yet have the appropriate type of clothing. We literally just had on some hoodies, and we were standing up in the line and we literally were quizzing each other because we found it was just so much information to try and remember. So we literally were still studying, just as typical trainees, studying right before this exam. So when we went inside the drive test center, there was actually a classroom that was set up for persons to come in and do this test. Everything was done on computer. It was actually a touch screen computer. So we basically had 20 questions on this test, and the maximum amount of questions that we were allowed to get incorrect was 4. So in order to pass this test, we had to score minimum 16 out of 20 questions. And honestly, this was the hardest test we have ever done in our life. And we have done a lot of exams and tests back in our UE days. You really did need to prepare well, and you really did need to study. So my tip is don't study and cram the night before. Take some time to study for this test. Somehow, some way, Cern and I were able to pass the test on our first try. And after we passed the test, we had to go to a separate desk. Basically, we printed out our test results and we presented it to the desk. Hardly anyone else had passed the test. Cern and I were actually the only ones at that point in time, very early in the morning, who were in this section of the center for those who passed, and we were completely shocked. And you actually were given another opportunity to resit the test within the same day, but you actually had to go back outside and line up for what seemed like another couple of hours. And obviously you would have to pay another fee for every time that you want to attempt the test. So we were both very elated that we were able to pass on our first try, but honestly, it is still to this day the hardest test that we've ever done. So prepare and study very well. So after we got our G1 license, we were both very elated, and we proceeded immediately to the front desk where we thought we could have applied immediately to get our what was known as the G license. So just to recap, in Ontario, there is a hierarchy of driving licenses. So you must start off with a G1, which is known as your driver's regulations. Then there's an intermediate level, which is known as your G2 license. And the highest or the most advanced driving license in Ontario is known as your G license. So based on when we did research on the Drive Test Center's website, we actually found out that once we got our G1, we actually could have gone straight to get a G license. We actually didn't need to go through the entire hierarchy. The only way that we could actually go straight to a G was from actually getting a letter of exemption. And this basically had to come from our embassy to state the amount of years of driving experience we had back in our home country. So when we actually got the G1 on the day at the Drive Test Center, we actually thought that we could have just applied easily to get the G license, but we were actually advised, no, we could not have just gotten the G license immediately. The only way we could have gotten the G license, even if we had the letter of exemption, we actually had to do a road test. Yes. That meant we actually had to do an in-person practical driving test. So yet another obstacle in our way that we had to try and navigate out of. So the first order of business before we could even book to do our road test, we had to apply to get this letter of exemption. So on the website for the drive test center, we found out that we could have applied for this letter from the local embassy. So in Toronto, there exists the General Consulate of Trinidad and Tobago. And we basically went on this website and we filled out an application form online requesting for both of us a letter of exemption stating the number of years of driving experience we had back in Trinidad. Now, there were some documents that we had to submit in order for this letter to be approved and given to us. So we actually had to mail in our Trinidad driving license as well as our Trinidad passport. Now, we were both very skeptical about doing this because, again, the General Consulate's office at this point in time was closed because of COVID. And the only way we could have gotten these documents delivered was in mail. We were very skeptical about sending our passports and our driving license through the mail, but there was no other way to do it. Now, at the time, we did have a rental car, and we both decided that we could not both give up our driving license at the time because we had a rental car.
Someone had to drive.
Someone had to drive. So we decided that Surin would give up his Trinidad license first, while I maintained my Trinidad license as we had a rental car. So we proceeded to submit his documents first, and it took about a week for him to get his letter of exemption, which basically said that we did not need to do the G2. We would actually go straight to do the G test. So after a week had passed, Surin was able to get his letter in the mail stating that he got the exemption from doing the G2, which meant he could apply to do the G road test. So unfortunately, at that point in time, the only way to book the actual road test, we had to go back in person to the drive test center. So when he finally got his letter of exemption, we went back to the drive test center, and luckily he was able to get a G road test literally a week and a half later. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, well, it's a road test, so this should be easy because we both have been driving for over 10 years in Trinidad. So we both thought, okay, well, this should be easy because we know how to drive. Well, that's not the case here. We were advised from a lot of our relatives, from other colleagues who had recently immigrated, who shared their experiences at the drive test centers. And we actually found out that it was unadvisable to overestimate your driving skills in Canada. We were actually advised that we should take driving lessons in Canada because at the end of the day, in Trinidad, we drove on the left side of the road. In Canada, we drive on the right side of the road. There are a lot more laws and regulations here. There are a lot more road signs. And as hard as it was studying that manual, you literally needed to know everything. So we took that advice very seriously, and we proceeded to start calling around to find out about driving lessons. And it also took another week for me to get my letter back. And then I also had to return to the drive test center to then book my G road test. However, in the space of 1 week that it took for me to get my letter, apart from Surin, when I returned to the drive test center, they told me that the earliest availability for me to do my G road test was in January 2021. So there was just more pressure placed on Surin because he would have been the only one at the point in time who had a shot of getting this license. And again, we had already purchased the car, and if he didn't pass this test, there was no guarantee that he would have gotten another test date booked. When you get the waiver for exemption to do your G road test, you only have one shot at getting your G license. If you fail on your first attempt, you're not allowed to reapply to do your G test until after 1 year has passed. You are only allowed to apply for the middle level license, which is the G2. Don't overestimate your driving experience back home. Driving in Canada is completely different to driving back home in Trinidad. Invest in doing some driving lessons. You really do learn a lot about the road laws here, and it really does help you prepare for this road test. In doing these driving lessons, the instructor is not authorized to actually take you on the exam test routes. They are only allowed to take you in other areas to practice the basic skills. We basically went on YouTube and we found out all of the exam driving routes. We watched videos religiously every day. We watched persons giving, advice and tips on what to do, what not to do. And we even went on our own, both of us. We went and we test drove on all of the driving routes. So we already had an idea, what would have been expected. So that's another good tip. Look at YouTube. They have a lot of information and resources.
So I went to driving school, went to driving lessons. I had an excellent instructor. In Canada, you need to provide your own vehicle to do your driving test. You cannot rent a vehicle, but it is allowed that you use the driving school's vehicle. I was successful. When the examiner told me, we came back to the drive test center, he told me I'm successful, you are granted your G. On the actual day, you don't actually get a physical card saying that you have a valid driver license. They actually tell you that it's going to be mailed to you, but they give you a small certificate telling you that you're successful and with all the information that your driver's license has.
So upon speaking with the car insurance agents, and when we presented the Surance G license to the car insurance company, we were informed of what the estimate would have been for our monthly car insurance. So in Canada, you have to make monthly car insurance payments. Now think about what you pay for your car insurance for your car in Trinidad. Can you imagine if you had to pay that equivalent car insurance every couple of months? Well, that's exactly how it is here in Ontario. As a new driver, based on several discussions that we had with multiple car insurance agencies, we were advised that our starting car insurance monthly payment would have been around 400 to 500 Canadian dollars per month. Now, we were advised that we actually could have gotten a significant discount off of this initial offer if we showed them a letter stating that we previously had a certain number of driving experience back in our home country. So once again, another obstacle in our way. Now, this was something that we did not know about while we were in Trinidad. So we ended up having to contact our local Trinidad car insurance companies, and we had to basically put a rush order for them to submit a letter to us to indicate the number of years that we had car insurance with them. It had to state that we basically had no claims. We had a clean driving record. It was emailed to us within 24 hours. And then we were able to submit this to the Canadian car insurance. And luckily, we were able to get a pretty good deal on our monthly car insurance. So that is another tip for you. That was another mistake that we made. We did not know that we needed to get this letter beforehand. So if you're thinking about purchasing a car, please ensure that before you leave your home country, you request this letter from your car insurance company. It will save you a lot of money in the end when you're actually going to apply for Canadian car insurance.
What I suggest, and my humble recommendation, is the person you're buying the car from or the company you're buying the car from, have a conversation. Ask them what they recommend if you were to look around for car insurance. So what I did is that I went to the dealership and my sales guy, the salesperson, I asked him, like, I'm looking around for car insurance right now and it's very expensive. So do you have any recommendations? He's like, yeah, I know of a guy and I'll give you the number and you could give him a call. And honestly, it was like half the price that the regular big car insurance companies were giving out. So look around and ask around before you actually do your purchase of getting car insurance. At the point in time, yes, I needed to get it ASAP, but at the same point in time, I don't want to be spending more than I'm supposed to.
So during our 2 week stay in our hotel in Mississauga, while we were preparing to study for our G1 test, we were also looking for our place of residence. We had only booked our temporary stay in the hotel for 2 weeks. So we had contacted our realtor, Deane, and we officially started going around with him to view potential listings based on websites that he recommended. And literally, again, we built a spreadsheet of various different listings, and we sent it to him like almost every day. We had around like 10 to 20 listings that we checked. So we literally would look at a couple properties, within one day, and within 24 hours, it was taken. And we were wondering, like, how could that be? Like, how is it going so fast? So he advised us to keep looking and looking, and basically we had to act very fast. So as soon as we sent him some properties that we were looking at, he validated it and he coordinated to take us to show us the properties in person. So we looked at a couple of properties and we realized that even though that we had prepared to give the 6 months rent up front, the reality is that this was during a lockdown period. It was COVID. During the 2 weeks we were in the hotel, we had not yet secured our jobs. So landlords were very unwilling to accept us as tenants. So we had a very challenging time trying to find residents, and we actually thought we could have done this within the 2 weeks while we were staying at the hotel. And we realized towards the end of this 2 week stay that it wasn't going to work out for us to secure property. So we had no choice but to end up extending our stay in the hotel. So we ended up extending our stay by a further 2 weeks. At the same point in time, we had a rental car, and we originally had rented it for 2 weeks. So we also had to further extend the length of time for our rental car by a further 2 weeks. We had planned for uncertainties, so a part of our funds was actually budgeted for emergency. That's another great tip that I have for any new immigrant. Plan for uncertainty. You don't know what's going to happen when you actually arrive in your province, and it's very important that you set aside some emergency funds. So luckily, we didn't start to panic as yet because we already had emergency funds that we were able to use to secure the additional 2 week stay in the hotel and the 2 week additional that we required for the rental car. And we kept looking at various different properties. Every single day we went with him looking at properties, and it just started to get very bleak at one point. I remember at one point, I think the anxiety started to set in because we were nearing the last week of September. So by this time, it had been almost 38 days that we spent in the hotel, and we still had not secured a place of residence. And we kept looking and we kept looking. We honestly did not know what we were going to do, because it just seemed very unlikely that we were going to get a place to live. And we finally went to view what would have been our last listing, and it happened to be the best out of all of the listings that we looked at. It was the best in terms of the space, and we really wanted this space. The landlord was still unwilling to accept us as a tenant, even with this 6 months rent. Brian, our realtor, who really came through, he really went the extra mile, and he used his negotiation skills. And luckily, and finally, nearing towards the end of our 30-day stay at the end of September, we were able to finally secure this place of residence. We were able to celebrate that, yes, finally we were going to be able to check out of this hotel. We were finally going to be able to give up the rental car so we could finally take our actual car out to the dealership. And we were actually scheduled to move in like within the following week. So don't give up. Just keep, looking out for listings within your budget. And it's really, really important that you find a really great real estate agent.
First order of business was to set up our utilities. There's the water we need to set up, ensure that it was in our names. There's gas. We talked to the Enbridge company in our area, set up accounts with them. We also talked to Electra, which is electricity, set up our names with it, ensure that it was billing to us and our property. And last but not least, we also set up our home insurance. Yes, there's home insurance, just as your car insurance charges you every month. There's actually home insurance which charges you for 1 year, but you could opt to pay it within months. So there are different payment plans available, but we have to get home insurance. These were the 4 bills that we had to put in our names in order to move into our rental property.
One thing to point out is that our rent does not include utilities. So this was an additional cost on us that we had to pay every month in addition to the cost for our rent.
Now let's go on to the different service providers that need to be set up for our home. In terms of entertainment, we needed Wi-Fi, we needed cable TV. For the options in our area, in Canada, in Ontario, it is very expensive. Just as phone bills are and phone plans are, it is very expensive. I'm telling you. We think back in Trinidad, we think that full on digital our options. In Canada, you probably pay 2-3 times the amount in 1 month, and you actually don't get as fast or as reliable internet or phone service in Canada. Honestly, you pay a lot, and you can ask any Canadian, anyone in Canada, anyone in Ontario, they'll tell you the same thing, and it's additional costs. So on top of our rent, we also have to pay utility bills, and we also have to pay entertainment bills in terms of our Wi-Fi and cable TV. So in terms of cable options, yes, we had a steady Wi-Fi coming in, but we really found that the cable TV was actually a bit more on the pricey side. So there are packages that actually offer a couple hundred channels, and you pay like upwards of $100 Canadian per month, which we found that it was kind of unnecessary. We actually went in on coincidentally to I think we were changing our plans with our phones, and we had a conversation with the sales rep, and he gave us best advice we could possibly get at that point in time when we were looking around for cable TV. IPTV is actually available on the internet. You can actually Google IPTV. It's actually like an Android box, like what we call back home Android box in Trinidad. IPTV, once you have a smart TV or even a stable internet connection, you could have IPTV on your phones or on your TVs. It's actually a fraction of the cost. So we got a rental property and it was unfurnished, like all the houses or all the rental properties in the Ontario GTA region, and we had to furnish them. So we were looking around at places in our area. Again, we simply Googled furniture in our area. I'll have a list below of the recommendations that I recommend. And one of the major tips that I will recommend to you is please get the Flipp app. It is the source. It is the source for all the major discount sales happening in your area. So I will actually pull up the Flipp app, and let's say for instance you wanted a pillow for your bed. I will actually type in pillow, and it will actually give you all the stores in your area that are offering deals and sales on pillows in your area. It was recommended to us by one of our relatives when we moved to Canada, and I recommend it to you. You could actually pull up the Flipp app right now and look at deals. As a new immigrant coming to Canada, the cost could creep up on you, and this is what I recommend to combat it.
So even though we built a spreadsheet when we were in Trinidad, budgeting the cost of household items, we actually saved a lot of money versus what we had originally budgeted. So that is a really, really great tip to use this app when you're looking to save money on any type of item. So that brings us to the end of this 3-part series of our immigration story. I hope that you found the information in these videos useful. And as you realize that this journey has not been easy, even amidst a global pandemic, I think our top tip would be for any new immigrant who is coming to Canada, COVID or no COVID, planning is key. Take your time to plan for an important move as this. Budget accordingly. You'd realize that there were some mistakes that we made along the way. There were some uncertainties that we had to budget additional funds for. So that is really, really important. From the time you land in Canada, you should already start to have a plan of the series of different appointments and things that you need to get set up. They say the life of an immigrant is not easy. In fact, we have been told that the first couple of years of an immigrant's life is the hardest. And I think that COVID just tripled that. So it is challenging. Getting to Canada was just one part of the journey. It doesn't mean that everything is well and good and, everything comes easy. There are a lot more obstacles and struggles that immigrants have to face. Stay tuned for our next upcoming series where we talk about living in Canada and we review the day-to-day life, what's involved, how to get through challenges and obstacles, what are the additional costs involved to live and survive in Canada. So thank you so much for watching. We hope you've enjoyed these videos. Please like and subscribe if you have not done so already, and we'll see you in the next one.